I have got a PowerPoint, and not because I want you to feel like you're back at school, just because I'm not as young as I once was, and my mind is quite chaotic, and I'll forget if I don't have something behind me. So I don't want to make you feel at school, but it also means I can show you more things that I don't have time to tell you. So it's a bit of a cheat. So I want to talk to you a little bit about why prison is disproportionate. It's a disproportionate punishment for women, particularly women who are mothers. Prison, I completely echo everything that was said earlier. Prison is not a safe space for women, but it's particularly unsafe for women who are mothers. I kind of apologise, but I'm not going to apologise for the fact that there's going to be some harsh reading and some harsh hearing during this presentation, because what I really wanted to do was bring the women's voices from my research to you so they can tell you what it's like. Alison's right, you know, I've got lots of experience. I'm very old. I've been a social worker and a probation officer, but I've also shared a lot of lived experience with some of the women who I work with in terms of the trauma. And it's a huge problem we have in this country. Around 312,000 children are estimated to be affected by parental imprisonment. That's more than by divorce. There are 18,000 children affected annually by maternal imprisonment alone. That's a huge amount of children and a huge amount of mothers going through a trauma. The women who come to prison we are missing and losing opportunities to support women long before they ever come to prison. And there are reasons why it's distinctly different for women, and the experience of prison is distinctly different for women. And some of those things relate to these statistics. Around about 66% of the female prison population are mothers. That's only an estimate, because currently we don't accurately record that figure. The real figure is probably near 80% of our women in prison are mothers and grandmothers. We know that, like I've said, 18,000, 13,000 mothers are separated annually throughout a rolling period. When a mother is in prison, one of the things that makes it distinctly different to when a father's in prison is the fact that only 5% of children remain in their own homes. So 95% of the children of imprisoned mothers are displaced out of their own homes. 14% go directly into care, around about 10% stay in the care of the fathers, and the remainder are usually with grandparents or other family members. The last figure is horrific, I think, and it really reflects, I think, the vulnerability of the female prison population. Almost half of the women in prison have previously attempted suicide. They've previously not wanted to be alive. That's usually down to the trauma that they have experienced before they've got to that point. 50% of women in prison have experienced domestic abuse or child abuse or both. 50% of women in prison have issues with substance misuse, and that often, nearly always, is rooted in trauma. So they're already a vulnerable population, and then you add separation from children. Then you add having your children permanently removed and adopted without you having any kind of involvement in that process. So then we have a population who are incredibly vulnerable, who, because of all of the pressure on women, on mothers, how many women here are mothers? A huge number. How many of you have felt pressure as a mother to perform well? We get messages from the minute we are little girls on what constitutes good motherhood. Mothers in prison are no less than that. They get all of those messages, but what happens to them is they immediately feel like they've failed. They're shit mothers, they're terrible mothers because they've gone to prison. So they're already dealing with all of that guilt because in their head they've failed. And guilt is a life-threatening emotion. When you combine that with hopelessness, it's even more dangerous. Other factors that make it challenging for women to be in prison, we only have, thank God, 12 women's prisons in this country. I'm not saying we need any more, we absolutely don't. But that means that women are located sometimes, on average, 60 miles away from home, sometimes 100, sometimes 200. You have a family of children, 4 children, single-parent family, trying to get children to visit a prison 150 miles away. It's impossible. So women don't see their children, children don't see their mothers. So there are distinct differences when women go to prison than when men go to prison. not everybody knows this, and I apologise if I'm teaching grannies to suck eggs, but sometimes women go to prison not ever having expected that, having their legal teams or their magistrates or somebody saying, oh, it's highly unlikely, you probably won't go to prison. And then women go to prison. Last year, 35% of women in prison were in prison for a first offence. So they don't always expect to go to prison, so they've taken their children to school. I'll see you tonight, pet. I'll see you tonight. Then they don't get picked up. Not only do those children not get picked up, but the mums can't phone them immediately. They don't know who's picked them up. Imagine what that feels like on your first night in prison. You have no idea where your children are, who picked them up, and you can't just phone somebody and say, will you go and get them? What does that feel like for the child? Mummy just didn't come home. What are we doing? What are we doing? That's just the other thing. Most of our women in prison, we are criminalising poverty and trauma. That is what we are doing to women. That is how we are dealing. That is how we are responding to women in pain. We are sending them to prison. And that has to be wrong. That has to be wrong. I'm not going to read all of that to you because I would run out of time. But that just reflects, I think, the challenges that women face in our society. We still, after all of these years, have 2 women a week who die from domestic abuse. We still have one of the worst rape conviction rates. It's horrific. We have 9 children out of a class of 30 who are living in abject poverty. And most of those children will be in single-parent families. I want you to think about what it's like to be in prison as a mother. You've gone to prison. We know that 50% of the women in prison have experienced domestic abuse. We also know that, on average, a woman will have experienced an incident of domestic abuse 35 times before it's reported. So many of these children left in the care of fathers are left in the care of violent men. And imagine, as a mum who normally is able to protect her children at home, is in prison thinking, are my children safe? Is he going to hurt them? What does that feel like? And then we wonder why the self-harm rate is so high in prison. Then we wonder why women kill themselves in prison. We shouldn't wonder. Beth, who was sentenced for shoplifting, she had a 3-month-old baby and she was sentenced to 4 months. She was breastfeeding her baby. Her baby had never had a bottle. She was not expecting a custodial sentence. And Beth said, I was locked in this horrible, lonely, scary place with leaking breasts and no baby. I held my pillow like it was my child and it was soaked with my milk and my tears. I felt bereft. I've never felt grief or pain like it. When Beth came out of prison, Beth's baby didn't know her. Beth was so traumatised by her baby not knowing her that she felt the only way she could cope was to return to substance misuse. Her substance misuse had to be funded for her by offending. Her trauma was recriminalised and she was prosecuted again. Beth took her life at 21. D, we think mothers in prison don't think of the kids. That's the first thing people say. Should have thought your kids. What did you do that for? Should have thought your kids. D absconded from court to get her kids, to put her kids in a safe space before returning to court so that she knew her children would be safe while she was imprisoned. Imagine doing that. Imagine risking that and leaving a court in terror to save your children from the care system. Shanice said she wanted help. Frances talked about the missed and lost opportunities. We have so many missed and lost opportunities that usually date back to women's childhoods. But women, particularly women, are terrified often to ask for help because they're deemed to be failing. If you have a mother who has a substance misuse issue, 9 times out of 10 because she's been raped or abused, how can she ask for help and say, I'm struggling, when she knows that the stakes are so high that she might lose her children? How hard is that to ask for help? I've actually been in that position. I had my first child at 16, and it's hard. It's hard to ask for help because people judge you 50 times more as a mother than they do as any other role in your life. And I bet every mother here would agree with me with that. One of the other things that happens in prison that people don't always understand, we don't just punish mothers, we punish the children. In a visiting space, in some prisons, children are not even allowed on their mother's knee. You're allowed one kiss sometimes and nothing else. How do you explain to a 2-year-old who hasn't seen their mummy for 3 months or 3 weeks or a week, no, you cannot sit on your mummy's knee. No, you cannot be hugged. A mum told me her child fell over in the visiting space. She stood up to go and get to her child. The prison officer made her sit down and said, no, you can't get out your seat. She told me that was state-sanctioned abuse. If she was in the community, she would have been spoken to about neglect because she didn't respond to the needs of her child. In a prison, she had to sit down. Some women find the visits so painful. Women spoke to me about having children wrenched, screaming out of their arms. Sorry. It still gets me being able to hear. Being able to hear your child screaming through a hall, through a building, and you having to sit in your seat. What do we think women feel like when they go to their cells? We look at the self-harm rates and we know what women feel like when they go back to their cells. So many women decide not to have visits because they're too painful. They don't want to put their children through that. Then there's a perception of, you're a bad mother, you didn't see your children. That could only be said by someone who had no, I nearly swore, idea what it feels like to go through that. Why would you put your children through that? But how hard is it to know which decision is the right decision? But not having visits has an impact on the mother, has an impact on the children, has an impact that goes on and on and on for years past release. Like Ursula said, it doesn't end when you're released. It's a life sentence for a mother. These are some of the things the children have said to me. And it's so hard to read them. Millie, who was 8, is it like TV? Will Mummy get food? Liam, why did the police wreck my room? I haven't done anything. Polly, 4.5. Why can't I sit on your knee, Mummy? Tell them. Shall I tell them I'll be good? Why did they look in Penny's nappy? Said Molly, who was 9, who'd always been told strangers don't touch. Strangers touched. If I can't cope with my sisters go into care, imagine that at 17, that responsibility. You have to keep these children, otherwise they're going to go into care. At 17. I couldn't finish college, but that's life, isn't it? Said Ian, who altered the course of his life and his life chances to care and care well for his siblings when his mother went to prison for shoplifting and benefit fraud because she couldn't survive on the paltry amount that she was asked to survive on. I think I was just looking for love, said Mandy, who got pregnant at 16, who could not cope without her mum. Prison is absolutely not a safe space for pregnant women, yet we continue to send pregnant women to prison on their due date very recently for shoplifting, or pregnant women are remanded in prison and, like Frances says, may very well go on to not have a custodial sentence, and in the meantime they've lived in an environment where they're fearful of their belly being kicked or punched, or they've gone to bed hungry, or they've had a bed that wasn't comfortable because the mattresses are this thick even for pregnant women, and you can't phone your midwife if you've got concerns about movement, or you've had a bit of bleeding and you've got to ring a bell and then they've got to wait for a nurse to come. 1 in 10 women in prison are giving birth in cells. We've had 2 dead babies born in prison in the last 2 years. Where are we? We're in 2021 in a civilised society, and we have women giving birth to dead babies in cells, or on the way to hospital, or women being handcuffed for an antenatal appointment or for a scan. Or in my research, one woman miscarried in an ambulance in handcuffs. It's not humane, and it's absolutely not safe. And there is a better way. There is a better way. And if anyone's interested, look at Trevi House in Plymouth. It's a resource that keeps women and children together, and it's amazing. So what do we need? Francis touched on this. We can't have good criminal justice without good social justice. We have to invest. We have to provide services to support women earlier. We have to divert women away from custody. We have to make it safe for women to ask for help. We have to be able to not need to send anyone to prison. Men or women, there are far too many people in prison. But we have decades of evidence that tell us prison does not work for women. It is not effective. Community sentences with the support that Francis described is what works for women. We need trauma-informed criminal justice, and that trauma-informed criminal justice has to take into account maternal trauma. I spoke to women who were, some of them were 40 years post-release, and they were suffering symptoms of PTSD from the separation from their children, from the loss of their children, from the loss of their accommodation that had their boxes of all of their children's photographs and memories and belly buttons and wristbands, everything you keep as a mother that's utterly useless and absolute shite, but it's important to you. And we know that hundreds of thousands of women have lost all of that because their accommodation has been lost when they're in prison. And imagine explaining that to a child 10, 15 years down the line. Mum, where's my baby photos? Where are they? Gone. We need more community alternatives to prison. We need to focus on women's centres. We have to, this is a massive bugbear of mine, we absolutely have to alter some of the decision-making in relation to sentencing. Currently, magistrates, and it is mostly magistrates who sentence women, have guidelines that they are supposed to follow, called the Bangkok Rules, if anybody's interested. But we know that they don't all follow it. We know that they don't all take any notice. A recent poll revealed some of them don't even know it exists. Those guidelines have to become requirements. The judiciary have to become more accountable for the decisions that they're making. Sending a woman to prison for a child's truancy when she's already a single parent, is that really going to help that situation? Is it? Does anybody here think that's a sensible solution? Absolutely. I nearly swore again. It absolutely isn't. Women are imprisoned for non-payment of TV licences. It's ridiculous. We absolutely do not need more prison spaces. I'm done. This is almost the last slide, I promise. And we absolutely have to get rid of short sentences and stop sending pregnant women to prison. If you're interested and you want more, there it is. And there's a campaign called Level Up. Please join it to stop pregnant women going to prison. Just please do something.